Hey folks, this is Tony. Before we get this episode started, I want to announce the winner of our monthly Vanguard tier Patreon drawing. Let's hear it for our lovely Vanguard tier patron, Class Antagonism. Class will be reaching out to you for contact info and send you the Proles Pack ASAP. For anyone feeling any sense of jealousy, head on over to patreon.com/prolespod. For the rest of you, let's start the show.
Welcome to Proles Pod.
Hello and welcome to Proles Pod, your bi-weekly dose of history, politics, and culture without the liberalism. You can find and follow us on most social media platforms at ProlesPod and on TikTok at proles.pod. If you want to help us reach more people, leaving 5-star reviews on any of the various podcast catchers is the best way to do that. If you want to help us with our vision, you can subscribe to our Patreon over at patreon.com/ProlesPod. There's a lot of great stuff there, such as early access to main feed episodes, bonus episodes, theory beats, study guides, raffles, surprise drops, and more, with more on the way. This episode is brought to you by our wonderful patrons. Today we're going to be talking about basically the concept of radical psychology and what that means under capitalism, and we will also briefly touch on what it might have looked like under a socialist system. But first, who do we have with us today?
Justin is here.
I am your host, Jeremy, and today's subject matter experts are Jon and Frank. So I guess briefly, could you individually introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about your background?
John Hook. I'm a PhD candidate in counseling psychology. Just about finished with the process, and so I'll have a doctorate in counseling psychology soon. From Michigan, and I probably started thinking about these issues of how socialism and psychology intersect and cross hybrid maybe like 7 years ago, so it's been a bit of a journey.
I'm Frank Gruba-McCallister. My doctorate is in clinical psychology. I taught for over 30 years in professional schools of psychology, and I'm currently retired. For a long period of time, I've been committed to the integration of psychology with social justice. At one time, when I was an administrator of a psychology program, I spearheaded the revision of the curriculum to prepare students to be what we called socially responsible. I first became enamored of this idea when I was still in high school, when I read Erich Fromm. But over the years, I've become even more committed to it. Since retirement, I've written 2 books for University Professors Press that are essentially books on the role of oppression in creating human illness. And more recently, a book on radical healing, which is the integration of many of the Marxist and socialist ideas with the practice of psychology and the role of psychology in social change.
As kind of a lead-in to the discussion, how would each of you define radical psychology? What does that mean to sort of the average individual? What does it mean to you?
Yeah. Since I'm the one with much less experience, since you all can hear, I think I'll give it away. Okay. Well, radical means going to the root. Okay, so that's pedantic, but the root of what exactly? Like the root causes of human behavior and human misery. And for a Marxist, that means looking at history, which was simply a way of looking at how the present developed into what it is, and that includes people and societies and civilizations. So in the case of suffering, it also means looking at people's material conditions and what contributes to their illness, and precludes their ability to take care of themselves and enter wellness.
As John said, the root meaning of radical is root. And so part of that is looking at what we are rooted in, but it also means to uproot. And that's the more prophetic meaning of radical, which is the idea that one has to critically examine the status quo. One has to critically examine what is taken to be common sense or hegemony and to challenge it, particularly when that status quo is unjust. To me, also radical psychology means that psychology needs to be radicalized. And part of what I've been particularly interested in is critiquing how psychology has both adopted and utilized the capitalist ideology in terms of how it defines what is wellness and what is illness, and in terms of how it often seeks to use its methods to ensure compliance with hegemony. So part of what we need to do is we need to engage in a process of self-examination and look at the ways in which we've been indoctrinated and mystified by capitalist ideology.
And you mentioned, Frank, in the early part of the book that Jon sent us to sort of read, I understand that this is something you're looking to get published in the future. You mentioned the importance, and you also mentioned it just now, of Erich Fromm and sort of bringing to light sort of a new understanding of psychology. I guess, can you speak to that a little bit? And also, are there other authors, other writers who have paved the way for what you two are moving toward?
Yeah, I mean, I have particular respect for Erich Fromm. I think he really was so far ahead of his time and prescient about so much about what he wrote. But he wasn't the only person. I mean, I just recently saw work by Wilhelm Reich, who was also a person who was trained as a classical analyst, but who early in his career was very explicitly Marxist. So there, and the whole Frankfurt School of critical theory. One of the problems with the Frankfurt School is that they were too enamored of psychoanalysis. That's basically why they booted Erich Fromm out. But there is a group of psychologists now. They typically call themselves critical psychologists that are returning to a lot of the points that Fromm pointed to, and are very much invested in, again, looking at the only disease that we have is capitalism, essentially.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, no arguments here. But real quick, just because our audience, most of our audience probably isn't super well versed in all the different terms around, in the therapy psychologist world, what is psychotherapy?
Psychologists argue about that all the time. Part of that is a lot of that is ego, really, because everybody thinks that what they've come up with is so unique and new and unlike anything else, which is really BS. It's sort of like, but basically psychotherapy is the methods that are used by psychologists to work with people who are experiencing some form of illness, distress, suffering, in order to alleviate them of that. The problem with psychotherapy, by and large, is that it assumes that you are the problem, that the problems are inside of you. So, for example, let's take cognitive behavioral theory, which is the idea that your beliefs are why you're unhappy. And you're working with a person who's poor. No, the reason they're unhappy is because they're poor. They can change their beliefs all they want, but they're still poor. And that's the problem, is that they don't situate human beings within the larger material, social, political context in which they're embedded, where what they're experiencing is completely predictable and expected.
I think Jon described it in the book as world bad, you good versus world good, you bad. I guess synthesis, world bad, you bad. Jon, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Actually, some people picked up on that. I didn't really put too much thought into that metaphor, I have to say.
Your mistake.
Yeah, exactly. It's there forever. The book is out in October, so it's going to be there forever. I mean, I think that the basic point there is that this has been talked about for a long time, right? So that typically liberals and positivists, right, ontological positivists, people who believe that the the world is as we see it, and there's no development that the world's gone into. People who naturalize things end up being one-sided, even if they try to, supposedly, there's a political spectrum, but we both know that the political spectrum is just one-party state in the United States, which is the pro-capitalist Liberal Party with its two wings. The same thing can be said of like psychological science, and it can also be said of psychotherapy, right? The applied side of psychological science. And so I think that I call UBAD the individualizing, pathologizing schools like CBT that Frank mentioned, that say that there's such a thing as latent disease inside your head. You have your mental illness is a disease for which all of the symptoms, like not insomnia, not getting out of bed, having a low mood, those are latent of an underlying mental disease, the way that, physical, biological, medical diseases work. And it says that you're bad, the world's basically good, everything's basically fine, and you just need to adjust yourself to the world. And sometimes that's true, and it's true to a limited extent for everybody, but it's not the whole picture. And the other side is kind of the social justice warrior liberal side, which says that actually there's nothing wrong with you at all. It's the world that's evil. The world is really bad. You're actually sort of a sacred victim. And what needs to happen is somehow, the more we say this, if we say this enough, the world will eventually change and become what you need it to be.
Be the change that you want to see in the
Exactly.
world.
Then it's individualizing political praxis, right? And so you have the exact same coin, just a different side. And so I guess with the you bad world bad analogy is just to say, like, let's just admit everything sucks and get on with fixing it, right? So, but I will also say the psychotherapy, right? Psychotherapy is the Greek is just mental healing, right? Psychotherapia, right? It's like just healing your mind. And when you initially look at this, like the psychotherapy in the modern world, it's easy to wonder, like, well, what could possibly be wrong with that, right? That was actually my first reaction when I entered a counseling psychology program, was like, what could possibly be problematic about that? You're just helping people feel better. But the more you look at it, the more you realize, like, it's how you help people. It's not even what you do. Like, we spit on CBT, you could do CBT and do it radically. You just have to examine the beliefs people have about capitalism and about themselves, that it will eventually make them happy, all this kind of stuff. And so people will often say, when you criticize this, I thought of this, Frank, when you criticize psychotherapy, they'll say, well, we're not here to make people not poor anymore. We're psychotherapists, we're psychologists, we're psy workers, we're here to help people.
Neutral.
We're neutral. And it's like, yeah, that's a choice, right? And so I think if I could sum up Frank and my work, especially in this book, available at fine booksellers everywhere, The Revolutionary Psychologist's Guide to Radical Therapy, which, by the way, we don't get royalties on, so nobody, don't rush out to buy it for that. If I could sum it up, it's to say that just helping people with their thoughts and feelings is a choice. It's a historically nested project and practice, and it is absolutely inherently political.
Frank, do you have anything to add to that?
The only thing I'll add is there are some people that are abolitionists that say we shouldn't have psychotherapy at all. And there are some Marxists who take that position. And I don't share that.
Feels kind of nihilist.
Yeah, I don't share that. I mean, there have been healers ever since there have been human beings, right? And so healing but to me, healing is a sacred duty. It's a social duty. It's that, you go into it with an understanding the complexity of what it means to be human, and that there are so many dimensions to that. But to me, to be healing, just means to promote people being more whole, which is what the origin of health is. So there's always going to be a place for that. The question in my mind is, can you do that with the understanding that human beings are also radically social beings?
Another thing that I think it was still Jon early in the book talked about was a necrophilic, death-affirming worldview that is purported by the existing like psychological counseling system, I guess, or objectives. Can you talk about like what you mean by that?
I'd love to take credit, but it was Frank. So Frank, you go ahead.
Oh, it was Frank. Okay. Sorry, Frank.
Well, it's actually Eric Fromm again. I have a good friend, Eric.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Fromm believed that that psychotherapy and therefore healing is a inherently moral project as well. In other words, it always is driven by values. So you don't have value-free anything. The issue is the person who's engaging in healing aware of what his or her values are and explicit about what their values are. So that's part of the negotiation, really, that you're involved in when you're working with somebody is, these are my values. They may not be your values, and I'm not even telling you they should be your values, but you need to know where I'm coming from.
Exactly.
You need to know where I'm coming from. But the other thing is, our values have to be to promote life, to promote, growth, And maybe that my client doesn't share those values, but that's part of what healing is all about. And so what Fromm wanted to do was he wanted to talk about societies can be either healthy or sick.
What does he mean by the death-affirming worldview?
A death-affirming worldview is a worldview that is based on having rather than being. So the more I have, the more I am. It is centered around a malignant form of narcissism, which is I'm special, the rules don't apply to me, which means that essentially you look at other human beings as things, as a means to your ends, which is, of course, what capitalism is all about, right?
Yeah, right.
Human beings are not human beings. They're to be exploited. They're to be used. And in the extreme, that means that we're talking about anything that goes in terms of how you relate to human beings, even if it means destroying them. So Donald Trump is an exemplar of a malignant narcissist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And his whole cabinet is filled with malignant narcissists. More for me requires less for you, which Adam Smith called the vile maxim of capitalism. He said, if capitalism is left unchecked, eventually it's more for me has to be less for you.
It's also the chief ideological architect of capitalism. Adam Smith also called landlords parasites. So,
People oftentimes don't understand Adam Smith was not completely enamored of capitalism.
and by the same token, Marx was. So that's always very interesting.
Yes, as a means to an end.
Yeah, no, you were talking about how people are quite often not aware of their own ideology, or that as a thing that sort of isn't expressed. They're not completely connected to the idea that they are part of a system. You know what I mean? They see themselves as outside of it, or they're not and this is partially because neoliberal capitalism is sort of hegemonic and therefore invisible in a lot of ways to people who live under it. And it just reminded me of that quote by Levi Strauss that's I therefore claim to show not how men think in myths, but how myths operate in their minds without their even being aware of the fact. And that is, I think, central to this, because when you don't understand that you are ideologically reinforcing or recreating these same structures that you are a part of, then you are necessarily pushing an ideology, pushing a particular message without your even being aware of it. You are not cognizant of that fact. And so when you are providing psychotherapy or any sort of education or whatever, any sort of solutions from within the system, you are, without your knowledge, reinforcing the structures that you are part of, I guess.
Right. Well, that's why psychology is important as part of social change, because one thing that psychologists have figured out is that human beings are exquisitely capable of self-deception. We're really good at it.
Yeah, they are.
And that's our downfall. We really are good at lying to ourselves. But if you just focus on that, again, you're individualizing it. So what it misses is mystification or false consciousness, which is how does social and political forces operate through hegemony to condition consciousness in such a way that we internalize it so completely and so utterly that it becomes unconscious. But then when we talk about making the unconscious conscious, we're not just talking about id, ego, superego, all that other stuff. What we're talking about is the role of psychology or psychotherapy is to demystify and de-idealize, de-idealization, get people out of this ideology.
Frank has so many good concepts like demystification, self-deception in his work. That was the reason I actually reached out to Frank to be an author on our forthcoming book, and then he hopped on as editor because he knew so much and knew so many people. The basic Marxist analysis of psychotherapy, as Frank was getting to, is that it's a site of ideological reproduction, right? And so in the Communist Manifesto, I think it is, Marx and Engels say that the communists disdain to conceal their efforts, right? Communists just say what they're doing. That's what sets us apart from liberals, right? Liberals will, and even critical psychologists will either not take the leap into naming politics, or they will criticize those who do. But the reality is we're all doing it, right? And so it's not a matter of deliberately indoctrinating someone. It's actually being much more moral and ethical to somebody who comes in for psychotherapy by being plain about how we see the world and how we view things. I mean, psychotherapy has values. The American Psychological Association and other accrediting bodies have ethical guidelines you have to follow, right? We're not ethically neutral on a lot of things, right? And so this is just about getting clear about how we see the world. And so that's one of one of the purposes of the books, was just to lay out not necessarily a very broad-based left-wing material approach to how you could see psychotherapy from a lot of different people's viewpoints. And the main thing is that we see psychotherapy as a site of contradiction, right? It's a primary intervention in the contradictions of capitalism, and you can either reify capitalist hegemony or you can challenge it, and that's kind of the gist of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So one of the authors that I think you referenced in the book was Paulo Freire. Freire. How do you spell? Can you talk a bit about like what his opinion on internalized oppression was and how that kind of intersects with what you were just talking about?
Well, Paulo Freire is an important person, particularly because he was working with the problem of colonialism in the global South. And we're not living in a post-colonial world, contrary to what a lot of people say. It's like, well, we don't explicitly have colonies anymore. Well, I mean, Israel certainly does, but
right.
But what Paulo Freire talks about is what he called critical pedagogy. Education could be used as a means of liberation. But he said you have to go and break down this power dynamic between teacher and student, where teacher is the possessor of knowledge who pours the knowledge into the heads of the students. He called that banking education, like depositing information. He believed that you had to use dialogue, where people are equals, and that the oppressed are the experts on what it means to be oppressed. But you had to help them to connect their everyday experiences of oppression with the larger forces that were at work in causing them to be oppressed. And he called that conscientization or consciousness raising consciousness, which we've been talking about that as, again, demystification or breaking down the myths, which is, well, we're colonized because we're inferior, and European culture is clearly more progressive than we are, and we deserve being poor, that kind of stuff. He says that's the first step. And then the second step is then enunciation, which is once you understand you're oppressed, can you conceive of an alternative world that would be liberatory? And then how can you work towards that? So his work has been seminal and is still very much a part of decolonial literature.
Yeah, nice. And I guess building off of that, maybe you can talk to this, Jon. I thought, it's super obvious, like once you think about it, but we talk often about like social constructs. Gender is a social construct, and the idea that self is a social construct is, like I said, is very obvious, but at the same time, it's like very radical. And so maybe, you could just kind of talk about how that manifests and how it manifested and where that like originates.
Oh, so just a very small question.
Yeah,
no big deal. So
talk about the basis of social construct of the self.
Yeah. I can hear the clock ticking. Well, actually, I have a book in front of me that's great for this. So the Soviets were very interested. That's a great segue, and you didn't know it. But the Soviets were really, really interested in the ontogenesis of the self. So how does a person, evolve and develop biologically, socially, culturally? The Soviets, because they're dialectical materialist didn't leave anything out, right? Everything has to be included in some way in a non-dual worldview, which sees everything as an interchange of forces, right? So, how does the self develop was a really critical question to a lot of the Soviet psychologists, especially really starting with Vygotsky, who's still used in educational research for his zone of proximal development theory, but was picked up by a lot of other Soviet researchers too. Their names are difficult to pronounce, but here goes. There's Luria, who is an amazing psychologist and theorist, Leontyev, and Lomov. These were basically people who were interested in all kinds of different elements of human, what we would probably now call human behavior, but also the context surrounding human behavior and including human development. And I think that was a really important question for the Soviets, because the question is like, well, what exactly is this project trying to do, not just for a society, but for the individual, right? And Marx's work really is deeply psychological. I think that's probably the reason that this compelled me so much as a student of psychology. Is I was a socialist already, but just kind of, I wouldn't say nominally, but I wasn't actively involved in thinking through the commitments of socialism beyond just sort of, barefaced politics. The thing that was really striking to me about Marxism, and the reason I really became a Marxist, is that his criticism of psychology, of capitalism, is deeply psychological. It's not just this, criticism of the working conditions of the poor. The liberals did that for decades. Charles Dickens is the best at them, and he wasn't exactly a communist, right? So, and in fact, Marx even makes fun of, I can't find the passage, but he makes fun of some liberals for suggesting that society shouldn't go through these periods of exploitation where, the working masses do have to, unfortunately, pull society forward through this terrible drudgery. Marx's criticism is really deeply psychological in its focus on alienation, which I'm sure your viewers know very well, but, alienation from your labor, its process, from yourself, and then from humanity itself, and from your innate inner nature, your Getunkswesen, your spirit, your species being.
I feel like that what you're talking about, Marx's focus on psychology within the framework of communism, socialism, is like manifests in the scientific versus utopian argument, right? The utopian argument is clearly like just this is the end goal, like let's get there. Whereas the scientific obviously creates the dialectical materialist basis of socialism. So I think that's probably why his focus, and subsequently everyone's focus, Lenin, Stalin, all the great theorists, is also very psychological.
Yeah, and society simply has to go through stages, and they're not always going to be easy. It's just kind of how it works, right? Historical materialism is not a way of prescribing anything to the world. It's simply a way of describing how humanity operates on a macro level. And as far as the development of the self goes, that was so important to the Soviets, because if you start with the premise, right, that we are individuals, right, it's like Margaret Thatcher said, there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals and their families, then you actually end up getting this really twisted psychological science, which is just sort of broken on an empirical level, because it characterizes human beings as abstract, universal, generic units, right? As if the human individual mind is this naturally occurring, almost Platonic system. And there's a really great old book that gets into the theory of it by a Canadian psychologist called Mind in the World, The Marxist Psychology of Self-Actualization. Frank and I have read it, and it's by a guy named David Lethbridge. It's very influential on me because he basically walks through how, and this was in the 80s, how psychology, despite having a humanistic wing, which said, hey, no, we're all naturally born for self-actualization, and having another wing, which was the Skinnerian behaviorist wing, they're really saying the same thing. They were both very one-sided because they're studying, again, these abstract individuals. And what the Soviet psychologists were saying, from Vygotsky to Lomov and Leontyev and all these other names I can't pronounce, even though I read a lot of Russian books and I should really learn, what they are saying is that no, human beings as individuals have a developmental history and developmental course, and they're influenced by their social, cultural, material conditions. And so the whole idea behind Soviet society and all socialist projects is how do you get a human being to reach true self-actualization? And that's another piece of Marx's work that's often ignored. Is, yes, Marx talks about class struggle and all of these, macro sociological kind of issues, But Marx is really interested in human actualization. Like, how does a human being become more and more and more and more human over the course of history? And I think that David Lethbridge calls it the infinite unfolding of human potential, which I believe is a quote from maybe the Grundrisse or something like that. But Marx's concern is deeply psychological and deeply focused on what we now call self-actualization. But the question is, what is that self? How does it develop? And is there really such a thing as a separate, limited individual person?
Right. And there's like a lot of focus under capitalism on the individual and what it means to be an individual and how to be an individual. But according to Marx, really, and it's something that like Ethan from the original Run of Proles would like bring up repeatedly, is that you cannot be an individual under capitalism because you are subject to all of these pressures to be a worker who is alienated from other people, alienated from the product of their labor, alienated from their own labor, so on and so forth. You can't be an individual under that sort of situation because of all of these pressures to be something that you are not inherently, and maybe we aren't inherently anything, I don't know. But you cannot achieve that level of being an individual, being a fully actualized person until we have achieved, communism, which is way off in the future, but certainly we get closer under socialism. I don't know if either of you have thoughts about that, or
That's absolutely what Marx says. Yeah, go ahead, Frank.
Part of the emphasis on being an individual in capitalism, and again, part of the contradiction of that, you find in the obsession with consumption, which is that they use your being an individual as a way of encouraging you to consume more.
Right.
So how do you set yourself apart from other people? It's because you buy this, or you have this sort of treatment, or you go this to, you do this. So it's the culture industry, which critical theory talked about. So it is a contradiction, because on the one hand, you're told the only way to be happy is to be what they might call an entrepreneur, be your own entrepreneur, and shape yourself into a product, what Fromm called the marketing orientation. The other thing is that by emphasizing an individual, another way that it encourages a form of consumption is through the biological fixation on the origin of illnesses. And, if you look at the empirical data, like, for example, schizophrenia, well, first of all, we're not even sure there's such a thing as schizophrenia, the way it's been defined. But why do we have something like schizophrenia? So that we can peddle drugs to so-called cure the person with schizophrenia. The only thing that's been found to predict schizophrenia is nothing biological. It's adverse like circumstances. And then the other thing is, if you look at the literature on psychopharmacology, the medications used to treat schizophrenia are good only early on, and that the longer people are on those drugs, the worse they do. But, it makes the pharmacology companies very wealthy.
What I was going to say earlier is, the basis of psychology in capitalism is, of course, the self, like analyzing the individual as a unit, abstract unit.
Yeah, it's the level of the unit of analysis for capitalist psychology is the individual. Yeah.
Yeah. But we know, every scientist on the planet probably knows, just based on like the fact of how children will just die if they aren't in a social setting, right? So we know that we are wired to be part of a social connection or unit, but we don't then use that as the basis of psychology.
No, you're right. We are inherently social beings. Darwin, who never said survival of the fittest, that was only when the social Darwinists came along. But Darwin pointed out that we are inherently cooperative. That's the only way we would have been able to survive, through kinship and by groups. But see, the thing is that as social beings, we have the longest period of dependency of any species in the world, right? Well, that means that we're exquisitely attuned to how well our environment responds to us. So that's the other reason that they don't want to focus on how social we are, because it highlights how our environment has a profound impact on us.
Yeah, Mark said that the self is in the absolute movement of becoming, and that things are always in development. And I think it was Vygotsky who described thought as internalized speech, right? So even our thoughts are learned from our environment, from people speaking, and we know this now through behavioral linguistic research. That's how you pick up language, and so if you pick up language that way, then you undoubtedly pick up you pick up ideology, and you pick up your core, as the CBT people call it, your core beliefs about the world. Yeah, and I thought it was interesting. You talked about how it's impossible to become an individual without a free society, without a fully productive free society that socialism and eventually socialism would bring about, and communism would embody. And I think that alienation, there's some Marxist psychologists and people writing in psychology who are Marxists who attribute all human suffering to alienation, and therefore what we need to do is abolish psychology. As Frank pointed out, there are some abolitionists, and abolish everything, and then magically tomorrow we'll have fully automated luxury gay space communism or something like that. But of course we know this is silly, because as Terry Eagleton pointed out, I think he says there will be car accidents, heartbreak, and bad trousers even under socialism. Grief is the opposite side of joy, right? It's to be human is to suffer. People have known this since prehistory, right? The Buddha talks about this. All major spiritual psychological traditions understood this at a deep level. And so the issue isn't necessarily alienation in the sense of suffering, right? Like, there will probably be people with very unusual and frightening and difficult, what we could, I think, meaningfully call mental illnesses or forms of psychological distress in a future socialism. It's just that what happens when you remove alienation is that you remove the chains that preclude people from creatively and effectively addressing the causes and sources of their psychological distress. So one of I think the easiest and most straightforward ways to think through this for me, which is in the final chapter of our book, available at fine booksellers everywhere, is to think of if you were doing psychotherapy with a medieval peasant woman who had, what in her own terms she would variously describe would end up, you would understand as depression or panic attacks and insomnia. What would you say to this person who has a literal landlord, in the darkest sense of the term, who, by the way, probably works less than you do? Peasants work like 140 days a year, just so everyone is extra depressed. What would you say to this person, right? You might not say, go kill your landlord, because what good is that going to do them? They'll have their whole family killed, all the families next door. But you couldn't help, as a modern person, but weave all of your contemporary values and the ideology of liberalism, if you're an average therapist, probably are liberal, into the work you did with this person. You would never tell them that, like, well, you're in the God-ordained natural order of the universe. It's always been this way. Don't question it. And so as socialist psychotherapists, all we're really doing is the same thing, but for the present day, right? I mean, what would someone in a future socialist society say to a modern retail worker who just survived COVID and is now dealing with precarity, and maybe they look Hispanic, so now the jackboot stormtroopers that we have can stop them with impunity on the street, right? So no doubt that your thoughts and emotions and your behaviors and what you do right in the morning and whether you meditate or exercise impacts your mood, but Jesus Christ, so does socio-political context that you're breathing every day. And so the idea behind removing alienation is not about actually getting rid of problems. It's creating more interesting problems for humanity to solve. And that's a theme that runs all the way through the socialist tradition. Is like, if you read the Soviet textbooks about what they had planned for their society, the things that they gave to their kids, first of all, they talk about freedom and how you should have ultimate freedoms of expression and of rebellion against your government and all these things that nobody talks about that. They were very clear about that. But they also talk about the whole point of having a civilization is to explore space and create infinite renewable energy. And, they really say what you will about how things were implemented at different historical periods throughout the world in actually existing socialism. People really believed that if you remove the sources of alienation, what you would get was not a sedate or utopic kind of Disneyland version of humanity, but you would get these people who were stronger than ever, able to address new problems. And so I think that our attempts at a socialistic, because it can't be fully socialist without a social society, but a socialistic psychotherapy is to try and think through those commitments.
So to kind of just quickly move back to the idea of self and the way that it's constructed in the United States during the Cold War, right? And I was 8 or 9 when the Soviet Union was couped. But the ways that we portrayed, and even still nowadays portray the Soviet Union, is everybody's wearing the same clothes, everybody's living in the same apartment, everybody's driving the same car, So this idea of like, look at how bleak it is that people can't buy a bunch of stuff that is different than the stuff that other people buy is just wild.
Yeah, because it is that focus on, I think Frank mentioned, basically consumerism as like your identity.
Yes.
Whatever you consume forms your identity,
You
not
are-
what you produce.
Right. You are punk rock. You are
Yeah.
a jock. You are like all those things are just based on what you purchase.
Yeah.
And that, it's just weird. But anyway, I pulled a couple statistics. I could have obviously pulled more, but in 2021, which is the most recent that I could find quickly, 25% of women were in therapy in that past year. 20% of men were in therapy that past year. So that already shows, to me anyway, the societal impact, right? Because of the pressure on women creates therefore more unhealthy like environments, whatever. It could also be on the other end, like the idea
The stigma of a man getting therapy.
in therapy, like you got to do it on your own. The age of people in therapy was the vast majority was 18 to 44, which is almost exactly lines up with the wealth gap, right? The boomers have 50% of the wealth in our society, and that doesn't include the people that are older than them that have, ridiculous amounts of wealth, which then again, to me, highlights the social impact of material conditions on mental health.
But it's also a generational thing of it's more normalized
Sure.
for younger generations.
But that
to go to
could be a
therapy.
result of the material conditions being,
true.
we need it in order to navigate it. So quickly, as long as you want, talk about, before we talk about like kind of your proposed ideas, concepts, etc., can you talk for a while about the ways in which I'll call it liberal psychology contradicts itself in the methods of treatment? So, like, for example, one of the things that stood out was the way that we, like, when it comes to intense psychological issues, you put somebody in a room by themselves and there's like 10 people watching over them. And this reinforces like the clinical gaze, right? The idea of something is wrong with me. I need to look inside myself to solve it. So, but yeah, just stuff like that.
There's, again, a kind of contradiction that is embedded in the statistics that you gave. I'm going to talk a little bit about the APA, which I'm not a great fan of.
That's the American Psychological Association.
They have a really bad sort of method for generating citations as well. I prefer APA.
Well, they have really good methods for developing torture with the CIA.
For you.
Thank you. Yeah, I like footnotes.
They did a bunch of surveys when COVID was occurring to document the adverse impact of COVID on human well-being. And in one of the last surveys they did, they asked, what is the greatest source of stress for you? And the items that had the highest percentage all related to economic concerns. We're worried about money. We're having fights about money. Then when you looked at what their recommendations were for how people should cope with COVID, it was stress management. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you you're the problem. You're the problem, Well, if you have stress, just meditate, or do something. Well, this is partly why there's complications in the statistics, because many critical psychologists have talked about psychologization, that psychology has become a dominant ideology as well in how people understand what's afflicting them. We manufacture distress in a way, as a way of getting people to come to therapy. I mean, look at the diagnoses that are in the DSM. It goes up every year.
Yeah, and actually the criteria for which you client or patient must fulfill to have a mental disorder, inability to work or difficulty working has increased in that work. I forget the name of the person who does that research has left me right now, but
Jim Davies talks about
Jim Davies, thank you.
Yeah, Jim Davies.
Sorry, Jim. I know you left a nice review for our book.
Yeah, he's going to withdraw it now
Jim's
because of you.
Jim's a big Prol Pod fan.
Yeah, Jim's a subscriber and patron.
So we create, the diagnoses are social constructions. There used to be a diagnosis drapetomania, which was slaves ran away, running away from their masters was a mental disorder.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that's...
Yeah.
Because everybody knows, why aren't you happy being a slave?
And
what's
you
wrong?
can...
Right. You're taken care of. You got a
Right.
place to
And
live.
it's
You're learning a
always...
trade.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and it's always easy to connect the dots looking backwards, right? Like housewives in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. My grandmother, who raised me, told me that whenever you'd go to the doctor, like if you had gained a little weight or if you were having trouble being productive, they would just give you speed. And she didn't realize nobody really had that word.
Mhm.
In the 1960s, right? This is just sort of the drug culture was beginning to churn. So it's not like, oh, it's medicine for my productivity. And eventually my grandma realized, she said, that was speed. That was a drug. Like they were just giving it to me to solve my productivity. And they also did this with housewives who were depressed. You have a white picket fence. You have a husband. Why aren't you happy? It's like, well, maybe there's more to life than being, an underappreciated home.
Here's some value.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. That's...
Just use some smile cream.
Smile
Right.
cream.
Certainly, again, medication is, far more people on medication than need to be. And most people, if they take a stimulant, are going to do better, right? That doesn't mean that there might not be some people who need stimulants. I'm not saying that, But, why is there a disproportionate number of African American males on stimulants? Why should that be? So the difficulty is, again, that therapy can be very good. There could be very good reasons, like you say, for why more women are in therapy than men, because of social circumstances, political circumstances, economic circumstances. But the difficulty becomes how the problem is framed once they walk in the door, which is you have to get a diagnosis. There's something wrong with you. We're going to fix you.
And we're going to treat the symptoms by and large. And if you do treat the cause, the only cause, because there are many causes in any causal system, right? The cause that you end up actually affecting is the personality of the person. So maybe you cure someone's depression or their inattentivity, their ADHD, or however you want to describe that. But you do it by changing their behavior fundamentally so that they fit in better. It's the same with this great discourse now about how whether or not neurodivergent people, like people with autism, should have to what extent should they have to mask their behaviors, right, to fit in with the rest of us.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very similar.
And remember, it's terrible that they don't pay taxes.
You're right.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
You're not an
I love
entity.
We got to make them
and they don't pay taxes.
Oh my God. Yes. An incredible sort of like mask off moment, I feel like right there was that situation.
Yeah, I think the
Wow.
main thing is it's in pro-capitalist psychotherapy, which is really there are a few outcomes I would love for a counter hegemony against mainstream psychology, but one of them would be to at least just get the capitalist psychologists to acknowledge that's what they are. Just say that's what you are, right? Don't think they want to in this day and age, but at least acknowledge what you're doing. I don't think you're an evil person on an individual level if you're doing that, but it would be nice if you would just tell people. So it's really a matter of treating symptoms and surface level issues, and I think that just getting people to cop to that. And also most people who go into the healing professions go into it because they want to help people, right? And so they're very ready for new ideas around these things.
Yeah, and I would, and if you need any more proof that so-called democratic socialism is liberalism, it's the fact that most new therapists, like younger therapists, at least the ones that I've researched when I'm trying to get therapy for me or my kids, are like would align themselves with social democracy,
right?
And yet their methods still reinforce the existing capitalist system.
Yeah, and that's an issue that I just want to say critics and psychologists in social democratic countries bring up all the time, that it's just really just not going far enough. Actually, someone from another person whose name I can't remember calls psychology the monotheistic ontology of late modernity. It's simply accepted as reality, the psychologization of everyday life.
Do you have anything more to kind of expand on Soviet psychology? Because that to me is an interesting subject.
John, you mentioned like when we were talking before we started recording that there were some not great ideas, I guess, that were practiced, but there were some that were quite good in terms of like connecting ideology and reality to psychology, I guess.
Well,
Yeah, I guess.
So I think that might be a great opportunity for an extras episode when I've gone and done some refreshing
some
on
more.
this.
Okay,
However,
enough,
I
yeah.
will
That sounds
just
good.
simply say one thing that really strikes me about the Soviet system. Well, first of all, I mean, your listeners are on the good side of history, but just as a preface, okay. To me, I grew up with all the same Cold War bullshit, Red Scare propaganda that now increasingly fewer and fewer people actually believe, fortunately. But it's still there. But to me, the Soviet system was a success because of its failures, right? So people want to talk about all of its failures and, oh my God, they ran out of food sometimes, as if we don't have people, waiting in line at churches to get a bag of processed food in the United States. Of course, and it will happen more and more. So as if, so to me, actually, you could say whatever awful shit you want to say about the Soviet Union because it was some of the worst conditions in which to build socialism. And yet, in I think it's 31 years, I'm 35. So 31 years from the end of the Civil War, it was 31 years from the end of the Civil War to when they had the first object in space. Okay, they went to fucking space. All right, they went from people pushing ox carts. I don't know if they had oxen, horse carts, and mostly peasantry
Yeah, they
to the
did.
world's first space power, and it was under. I hate to be, a little too enthusiastic about it these days because we're all so cynical, but under the power of dialectical materialism, under the power of believing in the innate potential of humanity. So anyway, one interesting thing, though, I guess, to kind of pop yet another maybe bubble of Red Scare propaganda that I think strikes me about Soviet psychotherapy and approach to Soviet healing is we have the stereotype from our media, especially James Bond and stuff like that. Which, by the way, the Soviets didn't have their version of James Bond. They actually just they didn't characterize Americans as evil the way we did. If you go and look into their movies, they were very deeply sympathetic to the American worker and also to even American soldiers. Very interesting. But one of the things that the Russians in particular, but Soviets generally, who by the way is again, your listeners and all of you know, are extremely gigantic, diverse country, as diverse or perhaps more diverse than even the United States in terms of all of the different ethnicities that it contained. One of the things that they're portrayed as being these tough, brutal, fearless, I must feel no pain, the Spetsnaz, the special ops kind of Soviet person. But the reality is, Soviets, in particular, I think Russian Soviets, were actually fairly soft, empathic, relaxed people. And so one of the more interesting things in Soviet psychotherapy is that there was an emphasis on hypnotherapy and hypnosis and relaxation and things that we would nowadays characterized as like mindfulness meditation, right? They had their own kind of indigenous, I think, really coming out of Russian. And of course, we're talking about a gigantic continent, but Russian and Central Asian steppe shamanism. There's this really deep interest in interconnection with nature and non-dualism. And so you'll actually see videos. There's a great Australian documentary about a crew that go to the Soviet Union in the 80s, and they meet up with dock workers who are getting, of course, free medical treatment in Sochi. Sochi had just been built as a resort town, I believe. And they're doing a doctor's doing hypnotherapy with them. And so it's all these very sort of strong, brutish, masculine Soviet Russian guys just laying in bed, kind of relaxing together. And so they had very interesting approaches to things, and that sort of just defy what you would expect from the way our media has portrayed it. But anyway, that's me kind of geeking out on Soviet stuff. So
Sure. And we will schedule an appointment. We will schedule yeah, here I go.
We'll schedule a therapy appointment.
Yes.
Yeah.
See, it's seeped into you.
Shit. We will schedule an episode because that's really interesting to me. I want to know more about it. Okay, so then moving into landing this plane while building the plane. So we've kind of like, in the sense of Marx, right? We have talked about the criticisms of the existing structure. Let's move to the Lenin phase of building revolution. Let's talk about
what is to be done psychologically.
Yes. What does radical psychology look like?
We have to go. We don't. I'm just kidding. Well, I will just plug the book and say that it is a first step in that direction. So this book is called The Revolutionary Psychologist Guide to Radical Therapy. It's an edited collection, which means it has numerous authors. Frank and I are the editors. The attempt of this book is a start, however imperfect, at answering that question from a broad left-wing perspective. Surprise, surprise, there aren't that many Marxist-Leninist psychologists out there, so we didn't, have a book full of them. But we have a lot of different approaches to try to begin to address this question. So from a structural perspective, part of it is forming a counter-hegemony against mainstream psychology, which is really just about bringing people together who have an interest in this and trying to figure out what that question you just asked means. And so to that end, Frank and I have started a group here called Counter Psych, which we're just beginning to build, trying to get Psy workers together who can actually do something concrete about these issues. But from a very specific instantiative point of what does a socialistic psychotherapy look like, I think there are many, many different answers to that question that individual psychotherapists and social workers and anybody in the helping professions can answer and can do so using the tools of science. But that's where I'll hand it over to Frank.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, there a lot of the chapters in our book are offering different perspectives on what would the next steps look like. To me, I've also written the book Radical Healing, No Wellness Without Justice, which is available University Professors Press. And what I tried to do in that book also is to talk about how we can integrate both the individual and the social in change. Because I think to err on either side is incomplete. Again, the person is not whole. If we forget about what's happening within them, that's an important variable. But I think a big part of this is, I was telling John that I was reading what was then a pamphlet by Wilhelm Reich in the 1930s. He had left Germany because of the rise of Nazis. And at that time, Wilhelm Reich, who was a psychoanalytically trained person, was also a very strongly Marxist. And he wrote the name of the pamphlet is What is Class Consciousness? And what he says is, socialism without political psychology will fail. And I agree with that, because you have to connect, how does the social trickle down, if you will, into the lived experience of the individual? And he said, a lot of the people that were pushing Marxism were throwing terms at people that they just either didn't understand or could not connect with, like class consciousness. Well, what the hell is that? So what he said is, you need to bring people together with a psychological and a social activist perspective. It's like what Friere said, start with their lived experience. So again, why are you having more anxiety about finances during the pandemic? Well, because of these larger forces that are at work, right? Because you're considered to be an essential worker, and so it doesn't matter if you get sick and die, because we need you to deliver our sandwiches, right? We need you to take care of the people who are sick, even though we don't give you the equipment that you need to be safe. You have to make those connections for people, and you have to tie to their emotions. Emotions are powerful motivators. It's not, we don't appeal to reason a lot of times, because that's going to fall flat.
Yeah, I do not believe that human beings are terribly rational.
No, but their emotions don't make you irrational.
Right. No, I don't agree with that
information.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, why am I angry? Well, you should be angry. That's what people need to hear. Why wouldn't you be angry?
Yeah, you're just directing it at the wrong target, essentially.
So my educational background is in anthropology. It's what I got my undergrad and my master's in. And my master's dissertation was written on the anxiety that is felt by people who work from home. And there's a particular theory called boundary theory, which indicates that the less of a boundary which is created between what is workspace and what is home space increases the anxiety in workers who work from home. And some of this is socioeconomic, because people who have an extra room that they can close the door on feel less of that anxiety than people who have to work particularly like at their kitchen table, for instance, or in a corner of a room which is used for something else. What I disagree with with the boundary theorists is that their argument is the less that the employer is involved in dictating what the worker should or shouldn't do, the better it is for the worker. And I wholeheartedly disagree with that, because workers will quite often choose to do things which are negatively impacting them. For instance, a worker who has a laptop that they can move around the house will quite often do that. And they will situate their workspace in their living room where a TV is on in the background, or they will sit in their bed and they will work in their bed. And that actually increases their own anxiety, because they have no conception of what is good practice and what is bad practice. They're doing it because they believe, like, oh, well, I'm comfortable on my couch, or I'm comfortable in my bed. But what they're doing to themselves is creating a sort of they're bringing that barrier down themselves. And it also then, that sort of perspective also puts the impetus on the worker to make the right decision, rather than on the employer to guide best practices, to be like, hey, the best thing you can possibly do is set aside a very particular space in your home where that is your workspace and you never leave it. That is where you do your work, and that will create a better boundary. But getting back to something that you mentioned sort of at the beginning, Frank, is that human beings are very good at lying to themselves and believing those lies. I'm going to describe a situation and then sort of posit a question. One thing that surprised me is when I was doing my ethnographic interviews is that a huge number, like 80%, more than 80% of the people I interviewed said they missed their commute because it helped them to separate their work life from their home life. There was a transitionary period that took place between, okay, I'm at work, now I'm in my car, or I'm on the bus, or I'm on the train, and now I am in this liminal space, this place that is not work nor home. And then I get home, and now I am in a different space, and I have a different sort of feeling in my body, in my mind.
As like when our dad used to come home, Erica does it too. He would go like in the room by himself or whatever, just to decompress.
Yes.
Before.
Right. Yeah. So one thing that workers were doing themselves sort of to supplement the fact that they could not commute anymore was creating a commute. And so one of them would, every time they finished work, they would leave the house and walk their dogs around the block. Or one of them would he would just push himself back from his desk in his rolling chair. He would like put his like hands on his knees, head down, and just sort of like close his eyes for a minute and like think about the things that he was concerned about at work. And then he would start thinking about things that he was concerned about at home, and then he would leave the office that he was in. Or, for instance, there was a guy who moved his desk around to different places within his house before ultimately buying like a prefabricated shed, putting it in his backyard, and then moving his desk out there. And when he did that, just walking from the backyard into his house was enough of a difference to create a barrier between his work space and his home space. So that is to some degree lying to yourself, right? You are tricking your brain into making a difference there. So do you think, and I guess another example for me personally, I was a very socially awkward child. I was very much a loner, but I didn't enjoy it. I loved being with people, but I just didn't know how to, like, it made me really anxious to put myself in the position of, whatever, having to engage with people that I didn't know or that I didn't know well. But I started to trick myself into being a social person I would walk into a space and I'd be like, I belong here. I am supposed to be here. This is my area. This is my space. It belongs to me. And that, again, is a lie to some degree, or it is a trick I'm playing on myself, but it did work. I was then able to then engage socially better. So do you think there is value in lying to ourselves, in taking advantage of the fact that you can trick yourself into believing something.
Yeah, I mean, those are really fascinating examples. And, the foundation of self-deception is the ability to think as if.
Mm-hmm.
That is really what it is. And that's because human beings develop the capacity for self-reflection. Because what you're doing is you're looking at yourself as if you were somebody else.
Right. Yeah.
To me, that was a leap of human evolution, right?
Right.
But it has its gifts and it has its curses.
Correct. Yeah.
And that's really what you're talking about. It can be a gift. Because if we can't think hypothetically, then we're stimulus bound, which means that the circumstances that we face, we'd say they can't be anything other than what they are, right? But if I could say, no, it could be different, that's thinking of as if. So the issue is, how do we channel that capacity? Is it a way, I would use Fromm's, is it promoting life or is it promoting death? Is it life promoting or not? And you don't want work to completely define who you are as a person.
Right.
But you live in a society that tells you you should have work define you as a person. And so it's
I talk
actually
about
healthy.
this all the time. One of the, almost anyone that you interact with, when you're getting to know them, one of the first questions that you hear is, what do you do?
And what they mean.
Yeah. And what they mean is, where do you work?
Right.
That is the primary value. How much money are you making? How hard do you work? Are you, and it's just, I'm always like, when people ask me, what do you do? I will intentionally be like, I read a lot. I play D&D. You know what I mean? Like, I try to answer that as, who am I? What do I enjoy doing?
That problem is so old.
But
that question is so old. Marcus Aurelius talks about it. People I think in his I think in his meditations, that was a thing that's implied that the Romans did. Yeah.
Incredible. It's social relations, just where your value is to the society. John,
I did just want to add one thing. I love you're an anthropologist, Victor Turnerian description of ritual. You said liminal space in the car. That kind of reminded me of him. Victor Turner's pretty great. So you asked what therapy could become. Well, there's some good answers in what you just described, right? It could become a ritualistic liminal space where you suspend the logic of capitalism and its false dichotomies. You suspend all of the morass of liberal ideology, neoliberalism, and you just begin to question what would happen as if you lived as if this was not the only way, or as if these things weren't true, or as if the commitments and aspirations and affiliations of socialism were true already, right? As if you were working with a therapist. If you're working with a therapist with those commitments, it's as if you're working with someone together alongside with someone who's thinking from the future and not from the present.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that ties in to another thing that I talk about all the time, which is when you truly understand, Marxism, Leninism, which is essentially the synthesis of dialectical materialism, dialectical historicalism, with liberation psychology, you're fucked up forever. You can't ever,
you can't unsee it.
You cannot ever look at the world exactly. And so I think that's an interesting thing. But John, as a, kind of younger person with a questionable haircut, how do you feel? How do you feel about the future of how do you envision the future of radical psychology in this capitalist hellscape that we live in right now?
My son, who's visiting right now, has the same haircut. If it makes you feel
well, I'm trying to stay relevant with the youth.
It's part of your therapy thing, right? You gotta connect with
right.
them.
I put my hat on sideways. How do I envision it? I think that many of the people that I contacted when I first started asking this question would essentially say, I don't think psychotherapy, not many, but some, I don't think psychotherapy is a good place for a political radical. And I, at some hours of some days, would agree, except for the fact that all of these young and early career therapists are almost talking about socialism or at least left wing material politics without knowing that's what they're doing, or asking questions for which
Mm.
Marxism has many contradictory even answers because it's such a rich and diverse tradition. And not to say nothing of the other left wing traditions, of which I am at times a fan and at times not. And so I think that there's a multiplicity of answers to what that looks like. But the most important thing is that people begin to understand what kind of ideological work they're doing and what they're reproducing in psychotherapy and begin to rethink their commitments and feel that they have permission to take a new approach. And so and they very much do have that authority, and my hope is that young and early career people would know that they have what they need to be effective at healing people's distress, because we're not just having someone who's suicidal come in and then say, well, don't worry, socialism will happen in 300 years, right? You need to do something for them then and
Yeah.
there, as well as sort of build this consciousness of the evolution of the hopefully coming evolution of humankind. So I think there are a lot of different answers to that, but I think the main one is that it is twofold. It's that psychotherapy begins to work within systems. So you don't need to be an expert in housing. You can't be, and you shouldn't try to be, to get someone housing. You just need to know somebody who does work in housing, tenants' rights, that kind of thing. Could be pro bono work, mutual aid. It could even be charities, in certain contexts. Getting involved in systems that can address the material needs of the people you're working with. Social workers are already pretty good at this, and I hear that there's quite a burgeoning movement of radical social workers now, younger people, and getting in and building dual power, right? So I see that psychotherapy, if it's in its radical form, becomes a form of dual power and prefigurative politics. And then the other thing is, how does it look in the dyad or in the group therapy setting? Is that it should look much more creative, right? I think if we're going to go anywhere, it's going to have to get pretty weird, and not in like a questionable, unethical way, but in a, psychotherapy doesn't need to be two people sitting in a windowless room talking about your childhood trauma. Actually, if you export those methods to other countries, they don't work in cultures where, because people are like, what, why am I in this weird room? Like, you realize, like, everything we're doing is a kind of Turnerian ritualistic thing. I mean, professional managerial dress, business casual, is ritualistic garb. So there's the twofold thing. There's the one of working in systems to build dual power in prefigurative politics, and the other is getting really creative and interesting, both ideologically and ethically, but also just in terms of the methods used for psychotherapy. And to that end, I will plug again, just because you mentioned D&D. The one great example of that is that people do Dungeons and Dragons as therapy with kids, because the buy-in is so much more successful, and the
Mhm.
role playing is already built in. You're living as if you're an elf, right? And what does that mean? You can live as if
Mhm.
you have all these qualities as a character that you yourself as a person don't have. So I think it's very fecund for 10,000 different possible approaches, so long as they're liberatory. And in fact, that's not only is that libertarian form, it's a libertarian function to have that many kind of approaches, right?
John, what's your tabletop RPG all about?
Surreal Punk is a sort of satirical, but also it's a satirical subversion of Dungeons and Dragons, but it's also mechanistically, it's designed as a game system to sort of fully deliver on that promise that in an RPG you can do whatever you want to do, as long as you're willing to pay the price, without it becoming sort of this like cops and robbers level improv. And so it's grounded in such a way that you can really truly play a character fully and not play tropes. And then that surreal punk is just the setting. It's kind of like this postmodern, like definitely heavily Marxist sort of joke on modern society, and then on elves and orcs and all those classic D&D tropes. But we're also working. We have other settings too. We have nuke punk, which is like our post-apocalyptic thing. We have grim punk, which is more fantasy, and it's on itch and it's free for anybody who wants it, and we'll be kickstarting soon. And then you can give me lots of money, and I can abandon Marxism once and for all.
Excellent. Yeah, that sounds cool. I also am trying to conceptualize a system that is more grounded in materialist analysis, but also like is still fun.
Still fun to play.
Yeah, finding that it
Yes.
can be.
Yeah, I'd
can
love
be
to talk
tough.
about that anytime.
But I was
Yep.
going to ask. Yeah, for sure. I was going to ask. So I'm not sure how it works with like psychologists, etc., therapists, but I know that there's licensing, right? And do you feel like if this movement were to really gain traction, that there would be a reaction where they start stripping people of their licenses?
Thank you for giving me something new to worry about.
Just go to a therapist.
Well,
it's fine.
I'll just say, Banksy says, or has said, supposedly, you are an acceptable level of threat, and if you weren't, you would know it. And so I guess if it comes down to that, maybe it's because we're actually making waves here.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's the greatest threat that would be posed to what we're talking about, because psychology is pretty wacko already. People do all sorts of shit.
Oh yeah,
and still get.
I mean,
licensed.
basically, you just can't have sex with your clients, and you're good.
Right. I mean, there are limits, but
there aren't many.
There aren't many. So, I think the greatest threat is posed by just our turn towards fascism right now. I mean,
yeah,
it's so extreme and in your face, but it's a gift also, I think, in a way, because I think people are finally waking up, to certain things that they wouldn't otherwise,
Yeah.
And, I want to just say that, another part of, I think, what's required for psychologists, especially younger ones, that Jon is talking about, is they're going to have to sit with a lot of discomfort that comes up with waking up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, and not run away from it, because they're going to say, all that stuff that I thought was true isn't true. And it's like, yeah, it isn't.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff that I learned is, stilted and biased. Yeah, it is. But there's an alternative. It doesn't. There's other ways you can be.
It doesn't have to be this way.
Right.
So, right before the episode started, Jon sent me sort of a little statement of purposes sort of paper, basically, that mentions the launch of a concept called counter-psych. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, sort of our Project 2025. Just kidding. It's a plan. So, and this is a classic Gramscian sense of building a counter hegemony. Big fan of Gramsci. I think he's one of the later Marxists who really did contribute something major after Lenin. I think he should be considered that way. If you're going to think about culture, this is kind of the way you should be. Culture and class powers is how you should be thinking about it, is hegemony versus counter hegemony. And so it's our attempt to create a radical materialist, broadly left wing, hopefully mostly socialist, but broadly left wing counter hegemony within mainstream psychology. And so there's a multi-pointed plan. Frank and I are just getting this kind of activist organizing group off the ground. We call it Counter Psych. And so our hope is to, help build radical praxis through education and intervention, through a podcast, through seminars, and then to basically get people organized and just talking to each other about these issues so that they can start discovering what those answers mean for themselves. So the hope there is also to be able to build some degree of power and organization in academia, clinical practice, even psychiatric facilities, and then also to cross-pollinate psychotherapists with other fields. We stay too siloed, and then we have all these things people are talking about which have solutions already that you just simply don't know about because you're not tapped into labor organizing or housing rights, things like that, stuff I keep mentioning. And then the hope is ultimately to build that kind of, what is it, like 3.5 to 4% sea change that you need for a sea change in terms of simply getting, I think that if we could get about 4% of Psy workers to just implicate capitalism directly in their work, that could really bring about hegemonic change. And it seems like seriously, of course, selection bias is a thing. I live in a very progressive area, but man, I don't really meet psychological workers who don't agree that capitalism is the problem. So it seems like it kind of just needs a little bit of a push, and that's our hope to do it. And so right now what we have is a subreddit, if anybody wants to Google that and find it. And hopefully by the time you land on there, you'll see a few more things, including this plan, which is open to anyone to read as far as how we're trying to organize psychologists and psy workers generally.
Yeah, any sort of details in terms of like the book and projects you're doing or whatever that you want to share with people, just let us know and we'll put them in the show notes.
That's great.
Sounds great.
Okay. Any sort of last minute thoughts from either one of you that you want to get across before we close things out?
No, you guys have been great.
Thank
you.
We appreciate the time and attention you gave to the things that we wrote, and we also appreciate the perspective that you added to the conversation.
Yeah, I think
Thank
you covered it. It felt like I was dusting off some old files in my brain, all this reading I used to do that I kind of stopped because moved on or said what I need to say. And it's sort of got me reinvigorated. So I really appreciate it.
For like a year after I finished my master's, I didn't read a goddamn thing that was longer than like an online news article because I was just like, I'm done. I can't do this anymore.
Yeah, I feel like Obi-Wan Kenobi or something. Like that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. Yes, psychology. That's right. Yes, I have.
Yes.
I know about this.
Yeah.
And make sure that listeners, make sure that you hop onto the Patreon and check out the card-carrying communist show that we're going to record
shortly.
Yep, in just a minute. So, yeah.
All right. Well, that about does it for this episode. Thank you so much to Jon and Frank and to all of our listeners and Patreon subscribers. The newest ones are Kira, Jim D, Elijah R, Wurtzel, Salelu, Alex K, and B. Doble. And a very special shout out to our Vanguard patrons, Comrade Chihuahua, B, Better Red Than Liberal, Coop, Lil Lumpenprol, Audigem, The Leninist Lawyer, and The Winking Cossack. Once again, if you'd like to subscribe, you can do so at patreon.com/prolspod for free. If you have questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us at prolspod@outlook.com. Please follow, review, like, all that algorithm stuff, and we will see you in 2 weeks. May the specter haunt your streets, and solidarity forever.
The mighty man, and the mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. Oh,